You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi, and I want to welcome you again to the program. And I want to thank you for listening, responding, commenting, and so on. And I really hope this episode also is to your liking. Like always, please comment. Please express your opinions. Obviously, there'll sometimes be things that I would say that you agree with or things you disagree with. It's always good to have a conversation because you always learn something from it. In any case, this week we actually have a pretty short reading, but we have a very, very important reading. And we're going to be reading the Haftarah Vayigash. And the Haftarah itself, by the way, I have to point out that, for example, I'm recording these for 2018, 2019, for example. And the Haftarah that I read for last week from Miket was the Haftarah that's supposed to be in regular years where, say, Shabbat and Chanukah don't really correspond with one another. This year specifically, Chanukah of 2018. I think it'll still be 2018 when we get to Chanukah. There's a different reading. I am just not paying attention to these readings. I'm reading just based on what is the regular series of readings which appears in the regular listing. However, maybe sometime in the future I'll fill in some of these gaps and do special recordings maybe next year. For the next sequence, I'll probably fill in some of these other recordings to make sure that you don't miss anything. But in any case, you also have to understand that there is a Bible series that I am doing with a group. It's a very, very, very slow study. A lot of people have asked me about it, but I think that because it's a very slow read, it's a very slow study, and it's also not for free because a lot of work has to be put into it. Not everyone's built for it, but if you are interested in a very, very detailed, slow study of the biblical text, we're currently in the book of Bamidbar. I've been teaching this class for several years now, and it's very, very, very slow. But what it does give you a lot of tools of understanding biblical text, biblical language, idioms, laws, everything, basically, because we're slowly covering right now the Torah. We're touching on a lot of details that if you were just listening to, say, a podcast that explains the weekly portion, you are not going to hear all these details. So I highly recommend it because it's my group and it's my teaching. But we also learn from one another as well, even though most of the time I'm the one that talks in the group. I have released a few episodes from that series, and we might do something about releasing it to the public and with maybe some kind of subscription or something, because those recordings is a lot of work. Also, the editing is a lot of work. But just to let you know, just to remind, and also, if you like what I do, don't hesitate to share with your friends. And also, if you really want to help in the area of getting material, because some material I just, even with my access to the library, they don't always have everything. I have access to a massive library at the Haifa University. It's still the sometimes books that don't exist, books I can't pull out, or sometimes I can't sit in the library all day. So it's also a way of contributing so I can buy materials so I can do these programs. So in any case, we are in the Haftarah Vayigash, and we actually are reading from the book of Yechezqel or Ezekiel, from chapter 37, verse 15, all the way to verse 28. This is a very, very, very interesting reading because Yechezqel, first of all, we don't really know exactly where he's from. I mean, basically, if you go and you'll understand why I bring this up the moment we start opening the whole subject. But Yechezqel, one of the things about him is that we don't really know where he's from. Our assumption can be that he might be from Judea. However, this is not necessarily fact. We actually don't really know exactly where he's from. So if you go to the beginning of the book and you read the opening of the book of Yechezqel, the very famous chariot scene, I'm using terminology here, but the chapter deals with the appearance of the divine chariot. We have some details here that may or may not let us know where he's from. So what's most important is verse 2. So it says, B'chamishi l'chodesh, on the 5th of the month, Hi hashana chamishit legalut hamelech Yoyachin, which is the 5th year to the exile of King Yehoiachin, or Jehoiakim. No, that's Yehoiakim. Jehoiachin, or Jehoiakin. I'm not exactly sure how you say that in English. It's Yehoiachin. And this might indicate that his exile was actually from the southern kingdom, from Judea. His language, on the other hand, has its own special links. However, he uses a lot of priestly language in the book of Ezekiel. There's actually been a lot of studies done on the language of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel, or Yechezqel, uses a lot of the language of the what you call the priestly language, or the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which indicates to us that he was well versed in this book, and he was well trained in the language of this book, which means that he probably did belong to priestly circles that lived in Judea, but this is not necessarily something that we can consider as fact, because we've also, the archaeology has also discovered that, for example, at Tel Dan, and this was a discovery that was published several years ago, at Tel Dan, which is all the way in the north. I mean, I live in northern Israel, and it's even more north than where I am. It takes about an hour and a half to get there from where I live, which I live near Mount Carmel. So you have to travel another hour to an hour and a half, I think it is, with a car, and then you get to Tel Dan. And by the way, the area is beautiful, and you should always go. A lot of people go to Jerusalem. I strongly recommend. I highly recommend visiting northern Israel. There are some areas which are breathtaking. As a child living in northern Israel, we used to be taken to field trips. Very, very worthwhile. But Yechezqel, we never really hear where he's really from. And he's not really affiliated anywhere. And his language sometimes is a little bit here, a little bit there. There are studies done on the language of the book of Yechezqel. I don't remember all the details of what was said there, but one of the things that's most important is that Yechezqel has a very, very strong affiliation with the language of the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, being a very priestly book, would be something that he should know, because he is considered to be a Kohen. And he actually says in verse 3, Dvar Adonai el Yechezqel ben Buzi HaKohen, the word of the Lord to Yechezqel, son of Buzi the Kohen. So this is very very indicative of why he uses this type of language. But what's interesting is his father's name is Buzi. That raises some questions about, could it be that his father was actually from the north? So a lot of different questions that I have to ask myself here. But our chapter is very telling about what he wants the people of Israel to be like. This is a very, very important chapter. Now, tell the truth, there are entire teachings out there. You know, I don't come from a Christian background. I come from a Jewish background. For us, Israel is Israel. We have all the tribes in our mind as being how Israel should look. And this is why these types of teachings are things that I can identify with to some degree. However, it's become, I would say, a bit of a decisive and divisive tool amongst a lot of teachers, which is what really breaks my heart when it comes to these types of things, because everyone wants to feel special. Everyone wants to feel very, very special. Everyone wants to be the one that God loves. And I can understand that. It's very, very understandable. It's very understandable why people have these sentiments. We also have the problem of identity, since basically I would say the 1800s, there've been a lot of difficulty for people when it comes to identity, which created, for example, British Israelism, which today is today there's a strong move. I don't know how much of a strong move, but there's a movement of a lot of people from Europe who are trying to identify as Israel. There are people who teach that the different nations of Europe are Israel in some way or another. I have to say, by the way, as an historian, none of it's true. We know the history of everyone in Europe. We know where everyone came from. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of names, like, for example, the Gotu, which is basically the fathers of the Goths. Blonde people were walking around in the area of the ancient Near East. We have imagery of Europe, of people that we today affiliate as Europeans, even though most Europeans can trace their ancestry into what we would call the East. because Europe itself was empty for a very, very long time. Northern Europe, no one really lived there. Slowly, people moved in. I mean, we know the history of how Greenland was inhabited, and how Iceland was inhabited, and how Germany. All the history is very, very well known to us. There's nothing special, nothing unusual. But there have been people who have been trying to teach these different teachings, and I unfortunately, these teachings are very, very misleading. They're not based on anything that can be proven. They're not based on any historical documentation. There's nothing. It's a speculation. But here's the big but. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, if I'm not a descendant of Israel, then what am I? And my response to that is, who cares? If you follow the God of Israel, it doesn't matter. The Bible never, ever, in any stage, except for one period that I can point out to, very specific, which is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and there were different reasons why they did this, but throughout the earlier stages of the Bible, starting from Avraham all the way to the end of the Book of Kings, we never hear that if someone's willing to be loyal to the God of Israel, that they are rejected. There are legal ideas, there are legal issues of inheritance, for example, that differentiate between a person who is a native born to Israel and a person who's joined Israel. But at the end of the day, a person who's loyal to the God of Israel is going to be considered Israel, period. It doesn't matter. These attempts to try to create identities, and these attempts to try to say, oh, I'm Israel in one way or another, and so on, these are things which are not important. They cause distraction, and even more so, they're even fueling hatred. There are people who so want to identify as Israel that they've developed forms of anti-Semitism, they've developed forms of hatred. I've sometimes received some messages that it's shocking what some people believe, how they get offended over something, my ancestors. And these are people that tracing their lineage is extremely easy. You have cases where people want to identify as Israel, and then they start throwing mud at Jews because they want to be Israel. For this is the reason why Jews are very sometimes closed off towards outside groups, because we have stuff like that. Because we have persecution because we're Jewish, and then we have persecution because we're this, and then it gets insane. There's no win situation here as a Jew, because everything is about you wanting to be the special. Jews were a very interesting example. You take the writings of Tacitus. You call him in English Tacitus or something like that. Real name was Tacitus. Okay, there's a lot of butchering of Roman names amongst English speakers. I have European friends that always make fun of this. That I use a term. Oh yeah, we know what you mean. That someone from England or the United States or New Zealand or something, or Australia would say the name, and we're looking around like that's not how you say it. Tacitus, for example, made fun of the Jews, that the Jews didn't have was rested on Shabbat, and said the Jews were lazy. They worked, they had an 8-day cycle, and they had their market day, and they always worked and everything. The Jews have this weird day that they rest. Couple centuries later, suddenly the church wants to have a day of rest, and suddenly everyone's trying to be the people that the Bible is speaking about. And when you have to deal with a reality like that, you have to always think about Tuvia, the milkman from Fiddle on the Roof, lift up your hands and saying, okay, whatever. It's a situation like that. And that's why this chapter is so important, because this chapter is trying to say something completely different. It's trying to push something completely different. The problem that we have as a society is that we have politics, and we have identity, and we have our cultures, and we all want to feel special. And we all want to be this, and we all want to be that, and we forget something which is above all. The one thing above all, which is God, which the reason that Israel was chosen, and the reason a Torah was given, And the reason there was an Exodus, and the reason that there's a Bible, and the reason there was prophecy, and the prophecy was recorded, and the reason that all of this exists is not because of the me. It's not because of the I. It's not even the we. It's because we're supposed to be servants of the Most High. Because, true, you have Israel, which are actually descendants of Israel. Jews, people who have most definitely have lost their ancestry, history, Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity, people who were exiled and forgot who they were. I have no doubt that there are people out there in different places of different, even races, after so many generations, that their outside appearance has changed from what an Israelite would look. But they're still our brothers, they're still our family. So if someone walks up to me, and I've been doing this for years, I used to be very, very suspicious, very, very suspicious. I even confronted a very good friend of mine, a dear, dear friend of mine. I confronted him to make sure that there's some ultimate motive, something that's hiding there, looking behind his smile. And I started learning about the world of people who want to be Torah keepers, who are not necessarily descendants of Israel, and the amount of passion that I've seen there, with all the arguments that we can have, all the arguments that we can have over what we believe and don't believe. The people that I've had conversations with, the people that have been able to sit down and have a real conversation, always have one focus in their mind, and the focus is that they want to know Torah, that they want to know the God of Israel. They'll put aside differences of opinions about certain things. They'll put aside racism. They'll put aside xenophobia. They'll put aside anti-Semitism, which is rancid in a lot of places, unfortunately. And right now, I'm pre-recording this, but we had shootings in different places. Always people calling death for Jews and so on. But then they ask this person what they believe. They say, "Oh, I believe in Jesus. I believe in Yeshua." And you look at them and you see, don't you realize this man was a Jew? But you rejected him. But again, your anti-Semitism is based also on racism. Don't you forget that this man was actually a Jew? Regardless, I know there are probably also Jewish listeners who are listening to this as well. And what I'm really trying to point out here is that the problem that we have with religion, I don't think religion is a bad word. I don't think religion is a bad word at all. I think the terminology is perfectly fine. I think that it's perfectly fine that we have terms like this. And I think I wrote an article about is Torah religion, and they say, listen, the problem is that people use this word and they hear something and they try to push a certain idea, and someone has an idea and they throw it in and they say religion's bad, and they start telling you why religion is bad. And by the way, that term, the idea of religion is bad, is actually something, as far as I know, socialists invented. Okay, so you have to sometimes think very, very closely about how your mind has been programmed with using certain words. I happened to actually sit not long ago in a lecture about mind programming through television, and the lecturer, I was actually sitting next to their door. It wasn't even my class. I just happened to sit there waiting for my class to enter, and I was listening. And the lecturer was talking on and on about, how someone throws an idea out there. No one stops to think if the idea is even correct. It just sounds very, very appealing. A lot of these ideas of helping one another and so on, but you don't always see the twist that's inside it. And what's very, very interesting about our chapter is that Ezekiel, the chapter itself is structured in a way where we have emphasis on very, very specific things. Now, there's also the very interesting question, why specifically this reading? Well, it's very simple, because he's talking about the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And what happens to be the situation in Vayigash, Vayigash elav Yehuda vayomer. Yehuda approaches Joseph. Vayigash is rather a legal term, and in my Torah series, I actually spoke about this as being a legal term. He was about to approach Yosef with a legal argument. But the main thing is that we see an interaction of argument between two brothers who are considered to be the firstborns of the family. Reuven lost that right, and it happens to be that I actually got to meet a lady, and I think I mentioned her some other time. But if not, her name is Dr. Tzafira Ben Barak. And she actually wrote a book about women inheriting, which works really well with what I'm about to say. And she was kind enough to actually give me a copy of her book, because apparently you can't get the book in the stores for some reasons. I don't know exactly what they are. And she gave me a copy, and I started reading it. And it happens to be that I read a section about the idea of displacing someone as an inheritor. So in the case of Yehuda and Yosef, we have a case of two brothers who are technically the ones who are supposed to inherit, Yosef being a firstborn from his mother, Yehuda being a person who received the inheritance as a displacement inheritance, where Reuven lost the right. And we also have to remember that historically speaking, Yehuda was much more of an assertive brother, and Yehuda historically as a tribe was always a very strong leading tribe, but Ephraim was also a very strong leading tribe, and that was part of the conflict, because Yehuda and Ephraim looked at one another and said, "What? I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge." And they were going back and forth. And then you have to ask the question, well, don't they both stop to think, well, Binyamin was king for a while too. Why is that? Because it's trying to make a much more important point, is that it's based on God's choice. But God also wants what's best for his people. The period of the judges, for example, was a period where different people were chosen from different places. Some from the north, some from the south, some from the center. The point was that as long as the person was trying to represent God and lead the people in the right way, it was great. It wasn't about them being the center. You take the case of Gideon. Gideon is approached by the people and they say to him, "We want you to be king." And Gideon says, "No, I nor my children will be kings over you." And then his own son decides, "Oh, I'm going to be king." His name is Avimelech. My father is king. That's the literal meaning of his name. And it turns sideways and becomes very, very problematic. And people die and they go to war. Because Avimelech is the example of the warning that when you make things about yourself and not about God, that's where things turn to the worst. And that's exactly what Yechezqel is about. He's warning that what you need to do is be together, work together as one group with one goal. Put your arguments aside, put your focus on what truly God wants from you, which is Mi ke'amecha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like your nation Israel, one nation on the earth. You can have arguments with your neighbors, you can have disagreements, but when you lose focus on the fact that you are here for a purpose, that you're here with a reason, and there is one God above you, if you lose focus on that, then everything becomes about you. And you become the center. The rise of individualism in the world. This has been going on since Greek times, but it's only getting worse. And we see that in societies, when there is no one set goal of purpose, everyone tries to pull to their own direction and forget why you're there. It not only creates chaos, it brings violence, it brings destruction, and that's exactly what happened in Israel. Someone once asked me, why does the Bible record all these violent things? And my response was that we learn later on not to do that. And Edward Gibbon, for example, who wrote in the 1700s, he wrote about the demise of Rome, and he said, and one of the things that he wrote, he said that the reason he's writing these things because he feels a responsibility as an historian to warn latter generations not to make the mistakes. He believed they were the pinnacle of everything. It's the whole thing about the Age of Enlightenment, but he understood something which I agree with 100%, which is these things were recorded to warn us: don't make these mistakes again. And this is why, for example, when I see people taking the Torah and then combining in it things which are obviously against it, combining pagan ideas, I literally saw a book called Judaism and Hinduism. I rolled my eyes so hard that my eyes almost rolled back into the back of my skull. All these weird things that people are doing, all these combinations people are doing, instead of saying, listen, we have this. We can have our individual perspective of life. We can live our lives as people as well with our own traditions and so on. Traditions are not a bad word either. I've said this before many times. But we need to remember that the focus is that we are one nation. Even those who are not necessarily born of Israel, your loyalty to the God of Israel is what puts you inside the structure. It actually strengthens us, because if you have a person that comes from the outside who is super loyal to the God of Israel, who who sees things maybe from a fresh perspective, that can actually be something positive, something healthy. I actually had a discussion this week with one of my colleagues at the university. We talked about this, and she said to me, it's actually good that we have people who come from the outside because it opens our eyes sometimes to things that we don't notice, which is very, very important. But we need to remember the one focus, that we need to be one tree, and this is really what happens here. We're one tree. And even if you have people grafted in, it doesn't matter. You are part of the tree now. Don't try to fight against the tree. So the idea of using trees and metaphors like that, you can develop these things into a lot of different areas. A tree is just something that grows and lives for a very long time and branches out and has strong roots into the ground. The symbolism is very, very clear, even though he's really taking not a tree, but actually taking a piece of wood, because Hebrew doesn't really have a different word for wood and tree. It's the same word. But the idea is that the wood represents a staff, represents leadership, represents control. It represents God's authority over Israel, but it also represents the idea of tree itself. It's something because Yechezqel had to walk around with his hand for symbolism, and prophets used a lot of symbolism in their everyday life when they were trying to make a point. Yirmiyahu, for example, Jeremiah with the yoke, Isaiah being naked for 3 years, not necessarily completely naked, probably he wore a loincloth or something, but the symbolic gesture is very, very strong and part of the way they worked. With Yechezqel, by the way, there's even some theories that he might have even sung some of his prophecies. Remember, years ago, reading a book by Rabbi Shlomo Min Hahar, who wrote a commentary about some thoughts. This was really a collection of papers that he wrote throughout the years, and he makes this interesting notation there that it's possible that Yechezqel was also a musician. He sang some of his prophecies. It's an interesting idea, but the focus here is the oneness, and there's a place here at one point that even the structure of the text makes that point. So it starts and it says, Vahi devar Adonai elai le'emor. So we already know it's Yechezqel, so he only says, to me. And the word of the Lord was to me, saying, V'ata vin Adam, and you son of man. And the reason he's called son of man is probably because he saw the chariot, and he got to see a lot of the upper parts of the divine world. And Yechezqel has a very, very elaborate divine universe, and it's a very, very interesting thing to study. I'm currently learning a little bit about this. The book of Enoch, for example, is a very, very developed, very late as well, but and it's late because of how developed his spiritual and divine world looks like. But Yechezqel is exposed to something, so he's been warned, been told, you're only a human being. It says, Kach lecha etz echad, uchtov alav liYehuda u'livnei Yisrael chaverav. So this is verse 16, it says, and you, son of man, take to yourself one stick, one stick, and write upon it to Judah and the sons of Israel and his friends. So Yehuda is not by himself. There's also Bnei Yisrael. So there's always this argument where parts of northern tribes also in Judea. Nadav Naaman now tries to argue that there aren't any and everything, but Yechezqel, even you can argue that some of this is idealistic. He might actually be talking about something in reality as well, where there are children of Judah, people who are literally the tribe of Judah, and people from the sons of Israel. It can be Benjamin, it could be Shimon, it could be Levi. There can also be fragments of people from Israel that fled to Judea. And then he says to him, Ulkach etz echad uchtov alav liYosef etz Ephraim v'chol bet Yisrael chaverav. And he says, and take one stick and write upon it to Joseph the tree of Ephraim. Okay? Because Yosef is not one tribe. There's Yosef, we broke to Ephraim. So we're talking about Ephraim being, again, you have to remember that the first king of Israel was actually from Ephraim, Jeroboam. So Ephraim is considered to be the symbolic father of the kingship in northern tribes, even though the kingship moved from one tribe to the other. There's a ton of research on that as well, why it was so. But it says, V'chol bet Yisrael. Instead of Bnei Yisrael, it says Bet Yisrael, the house of Israel and his friends. Why Bnei Yisrael and Bet Yisrael? Well, first of all, we can say it's a parallel, Bnei Yisrael, Bet Yisrael. There might be just a parallel here, and there's really not much to think about it. But it's also possible that Bnei Yisrael will be a term used for more the southern people, and Judah and the tribes which are in the south, which are linked to him, which is, again, as I said, Binyamin, Shimon, and Levi, obviously. And then when he says, Beit Yisrael, he's really referring to the rest of the northern tribes, everyone that was left, anyone that was exiled. This might be the right interpretation. It might also be that we're talking about a variant here, Bnei Yisrael, Beit Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael, by the way, reminds us more of the times of the desert, where everyone was together. Beit Yisrael sounds more like the idea of the tribal division and so on. So you might argue that Judah, because later on he does say David will be king over them, so he's trying to hint to the idea of Judah is actually the rightful king, and so this actually might indicate that he was from Judea because he accepted the idea that the house of David is the royal family. But so this slight difference here might actually indicate something complicated. It might just be a variant. And then he says to him in verse 17, Ukrav otam ehad elechad lecha le'etzechad. So bring them near, one to the other. Echad le'echad doesn't translate literally, and you don't always have to translate things literally. This is the problem with people who try to do mechanical translations. Mechanical translations never really hit the mark because they miss on the nuances of the language. I actually have right now somewhere in the vicinity of 5 languages that I have to deal with. And you when you move from one language to the other, you can never do a mechanical translation. You have to adjust the translation. And I've studied ancient languages and modern languages, so you never do a mechanical translation. And so draw them one to the other as one wood, as one piece of wood, as one stick. Vayu le'achadim b'yadecha, and there will be le'achadim. Now, this term achadim sounds like as if the one can be divided into 2, or one could be more than one. But le'achadim beyadecha, you could have said vayu le'echad beyadecha. But the idea here is that it's really, there will be like one. This is not to be translated as in the sense of like something is one, even if it's made from several, but it could be one and several things simultaneously. No, le'achadim beyadecha, achadim can also mean unique ones from one another. But here, because he's combining 2 pieces of wood, they are like one. They're not really one, because tribes are never really one. A nation is never really made one. There's different groups and so on, but the idea is to bring them together to be like one. Okay? Then, because we're combining 2 things together, they are achadim. They're supposed to behave like one, but not directly one. Not exactly one. וכאשר יאמרו אליך בני עמך לאמור, הלא תגיד לנו מה אלה לך. And when your people say to you, the sons of your people say to you, and please explain to us, for it will be that you will tell us what are these things in your hand. דבר עליהם כה אמר אדוני אלוהים, speak to them, thus says the Lord God, הנה אני לוקח את עץ יוסף אשר ביד אפרים ושבטי ישראל לחבריו. Now he flips them over for variety. So behold, I take the tree of Joseph, the stick of Joseph, the tree of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim. He's referring to Ephraim being really the head of the tribes. And the tribes of Israel, his friends. Okay? Now he uses Shivtei Yisrael, not Bet Yisrael. So this might actually strengthen the idea that this is just a sake of variety. Because with Judah he says, with Yehudah he says, Yehudah uvnei Yisrael. Now he's saying Ephraim v'Shivtei Yisrael. Okay? Now, you can also say that Bait and Shevet might be interchangeable as well. But what's interesting is he uses 3 different terms. Bnei Yisrael, Bet Yisrael, Shivtei Yisrael. In truth, what I want to say about this is more of a sake of variety, to introduce the idea that really, Bet Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, whatever you call yourselves, you're all Israel. You're all really part of one larger picture. It says, V'natati otam alav et etz Yehudah. Okay? And I will place upon them the house of Judah. And there's otam alav. There's a bit of a syntactical issue here, but it's better just ignore it. V'asitim le'etz echad v'yu echad be'adi. Now make them to one stick or one tree, and there will be one in my hand. And Yechezqel is supposed to be a representative of God. So his hand is supposed to represent the hand of God. God governs Israel, reigns over Israel, and Israel is one in God's hand. It says, "Vayu ha'etzim asher tichtov alehem beyadcha le'enehem," and it will be that these pieces of wood which you write upon them in your hand in front of their eyes. V'daber alehem כה אמר Adonai Elohim, and speak to them, thus says the Lord God. Hine ani lokach et bnei Yisrael. He's not talking anymore about. He's not using here the term Bet Yehuda, Bet Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael. He's using a term that reminds us also of the Exodus, to remind us, together. Behold, I take the children of Israel from midst of the nations, which they went there, and I will gather them from all around, and I'll bring them to their land. You don't have to force your way in. If you're a part of this, God will make sure you get in. You don't have to elbow anything. If you're a part of it, you will be taken in. It's not about you, it's about being Bnei Yisrael, about being one. Vasiti otam legoy echad ba'aretz ba'arei Yisrael. I will make them into one nation in the land, in the mountains of Israel. The reason he refers to Arei Yisrael is because really the mountain region is where a lot of the Bible stories happen and so on. It's also the elevated part of the land. It's much more prominent, but we have to understand that there were other areas, like for example, I live in the valleys. There's a lot going on here as well, but Harei Yisrael is because the mountainous parts of the land is what really makes the land very special. It says, Umelech echad yeh lechulam lemelech, and one king will be to all of them as a king. The oneness. There's one king. Velo yihu od l'shnei goyim, and they will no longer be like two nations. Velo yechzu od l'shtei mamlachot od, and they will not divide anymore to two kingdoms anymore. He's stressing this. He's repeating certain terms. He's making the word echad, shtaim, the two is negated, the echad is prominent. He's making a point. God says, I want you to be my people. I want you to be one nation under God. Actually tell the truth, the American Pledge of Allegiance, I think it's called. Not an American, so I don't know. I think it says one nation under God, indivisible, something in that area. And it's really what he's saying here as well, because there's a premise here, there's an idea here. Being one God, one nation, one king, and then obviously one temple as well, which is what he points out later on. But he says, but what's the premise here of one God? Velo yitamu'u od. This is verse 23. Velo yitamu'u od begilulehem beshukutzehem v'chol pishaim. They will no longer defile with their gilulim, it's a nasty way to refer to idols, because the root galal, some people refer to as being dung. So gilulehem, the idols which are referred to as dung. This is not the only word, but only interpretation, but it works really well with gilulim shikutzim pshaim. So shikutzehem, from the word sheket, something which you spurn. So shikutzehem, the things that they do which are disgusting. Uvechol pishem, and all their rebellions or iniquities. V'sha'ati otam mikol moshvotehem asher hat'u vahem. V'sha'ati otam mikol moshevotehem, which sounds like the word moshav, but it actually comes from the word shuv, which is to the iniquities, to turn away from. So I will redeem them from all their iniquities which they have sinned by them. V'te'arti otam. Now it's not a process. I will make them clean. Yechezqel has a lot of this. For example, one of the most difficult chapters to read in Yechezqel talks about finding Israel in the desert and covered with dirt and cleaning her and dressing her and so on. He's following the same lines here as well. But Yechezqel, also being a Kohen, is also very strongly obsessed with, I would say the word obsessed, but he's strongly focused on the idea of purity, even though Isaiah does the same thing in chapter 1. Here in Yechezqel, it's very, very prominent. I will purify them. They will be a nation to me, and I will be a God to them. But it's very important to understand, to read this, basically read from the second half of verse 23 all the way to around the end of the reading, verse 28. This is actually built in a type of chiasm of sorts, where the ends parallel one another, but it's also called it's called centrifugal, I think. It's the idea that there's also a center to all of this, and it's really structured like this, where there are things being emphasized by doubling them up in the beginning and the end, and in the center there's a piece there. It says, verse 24, Va'avdi David melech alehem. So it says, they will be my people. They will be my people. I will be their God. Va'avdi David melech alehem, and my servant David will be king upon them. Ve'ro'eh had yelechulam, will be one shepherd to all of them. Okay, uv'mishpatai lechu v'chukotai yishmeru v'asu otam. My rulings they will walk by, and my judgment, or actually my judgments they will rule by, and my laws they will keep, and they will do them. The redemption of Israel is connected also to the Torah. Anyone who tells you there's no Torah has to deal with this verse. Okay, so then it says, "V'yashvu al haaretz asher natati le'avdi le'Yaakov," and they will dwell upon the land which I have given to my servant Jacob. Asher yashvu v'avotechem, which your fathers lived in it, or dwelt in it. V'yashvu alea hemma uvnehem uvne v'nehem ad olam, and they will dwell upon it, them and their sons and the sons of their sons for all times. Okay, so we had, I'll be their God, David my servant, follow my Torah, and this is the center, dwell in the land. He spends several paragraphs on dwelling in the land, and then suddenly he returns to King David. V'David avdi nasi lahem le'olam, and David my servant will be a nasi. So instead of melech, he uses the term nasi. So we see that the word nasi should not be translated as prince, as many people do. For example, later on from chapter 40, he talks about the nasi. Nasi is again a term that really relates to the period of the desert, all the chieftains and so on. The term nasi in Yechezqel is actually king. He's referring to king, and this is how we know that you should always translate in the chapters of the temple in Yechezqel as being king, not prince. The translation prince is incorrect. I stress this. It's incorrect. There's questions why he prefers the term nasi, but this is not relevant to the actual translation or the understanding what the term means, which is not a prince, it's a king. And this, as you can see, because you see in verse 24 and then verse 25, he refers to David melech alehem, v'David avdi nasi lahem le'olam. He's repeating the same term, so you can see the opening of verse 24 and the ending of verse 25 are parallels. It says, "V'charati lahem berit shalom," I will cut for them a covenant of peace. Strongly reminds us of Berit Shalom with Pinchas in the book of Numbers. Berit Shalom is, by the way, a term we find also in the ancient Near East, where kings actually make covenants like this with people, and it's referred to as, something shalamu, things in an area where he points out the idea of someone having a peace covenant. It says, Brit olam otam, and the eternal covenant will be with them. V'natatim ve'rbeti otam, and I will place them now. V'natatim means v'natatim al admatam. Okay? There, he's pointing out the idea of, he's not completing the sentence, but the term itself indicates what it means. I will place them means I will place them on the land, because natan can mean to give, but also natan can also refer to placing someone, putting someone in a position. Untatim ve'rbeti otam, I will place them and I will multiply them, which means I will place them on the land and I will multiply them. And then he says the pinnacle, v'natati et mikdashi betocham le'olam, and I will place my temple in their midst forever. And this is really parallel to the idea of v'ani eheyeh lahem le'elohim, I will be a God to them. Okay, so really, the end of verse 23 is technically repeated at the second half of really verse 26, but really starts from the last part, the last statement in verse 26, and then continues into verse 27, which basically repeats V'telti otam v'ayru le'am, which we have in verse 23. I will purify them and they will be my people. To be purified also allows the temple to exist. And then I will place my temple in their midst. And then he says in verse 27, V'hayam mishkani alehem, and my temple will be, or my place of dwelling, mishkan. And again, using this term mishkani is not random. He's using this term because he's referencing again back to the period of the desert. And this is why he used the term Bnei Yisrael earlier as well. Everything here is by design. None of the words picked here are random. And it says, my place of dwelling, which resembles the word mishkan, mishkani, Vaya mishkani alehem, and my place of dwelling will be upon them, which really means with them. Vayiti lahem le'elohim, and I will be a God to them. Vehem ahiyu li le'am, and they will be a nation to me. Which repeats, v'te'elti otam, verse 23, v'te'elti otam, v'hayu li le'am, that's in verse 23. Vehem ahiyu li le'am, that's the end of verse 27. V'ani ehyeh lahem le'Elohim, end of verse 23, and middle verse 27, Va'iti lahem le'Elohim. This is all structured with a lot of internal logic, with a lot of ideas which all entwine into one another, and the terminology is picked very perfectly because there's an ideal, and this ideal continues in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's this very, very powerful ideal of the desert dwelling, the period in the desert where Israel was one before God, even though there were rebellions, true. But the desert takes a idyllic place in the mind, in the historical mind of the Bible, where God's presence was shown and the tabernacle was there, the Mishkan was there, and everyone could see the presence of God, and God interacted, and there was a greater closeness, because we have to also remember that Yechezqel earlier in the book talks about God leaving the temple, and now it's about God returning to the temple. But then there's an interesting verse here in the end, and he says, "V'yad'u hagoyim," and the nations will know, "Ki ani Adonai mekadesh et Yisrael," for I, the Lord, am sanctifying Israel, "Beyot mikdashi betocham leolam," by my temple being in their midst forever. And this verse responds to something that was going on at the time. So Yechezqel is a prophet of holiness. He's a prophet that deals a lot with the book of Leviticus in his language, and he's also a prophet of the period of destruction. So he's doing something very similar to what Isaiah does. So first of all, we have to understand that later on, just a few chapters from here, Yechezqel goes out on a whole blown-out description of a temple and the land being divided and so on, because Yechezqel is doing the same thing Isaiah is doing, but from a slightly different way of describing it, but very, very similar. That he's pointing out that the temple is going to return. The temple service is going to return. And everyone will know that I am with Israel because the temple is built. It is the exact opposite of sometimes what you hear from people. The temple is built because it's the representation of God's presence with Israel. And anyone who tells you there's no need for anything like that, they have to deal with what Isaiah says at the end. And everyone will come every month and Sabbath, people will come to the temple to bow down before the Lord. We have Yechezqel that spends a very, very long time talking about temple. In this section, this is where he really starts talking about the temple. He's already looking forward into the next prophecies, but he's talking about the idea that there's one temple, there's one God, one temple, one Israel, one king, and he's talking about that the only way that any of this could work is through unity. And if the unity won't come, God will force the unity, because it is his glory, his honor, and the duty upon us as people who follow the God of Israel to honor him by being one. We can have debates over disagreeing about details of what something means and so on, but when we start breaking up into smaller units, when we start fighting with one another, forgetting the greater goal and the greater purpose of being with the Torah and what it's supposed to tell us and what it's supposed to teach us and where it's supposed to take us, we lose focus about God and we make it about ourselves, and that's where the problem lies. Eat from this fruit and you'll be like God. Division is the greatest enemy of a people. You have to rally around something or someone. But the problem is that today everything is about division. Everything is about trying to steal someone's identity or not offending someone's identity and so on. And all these different nonsense that you hear in the world. And we lose focus on the one most important thing as Torah followers. To be one nation, serving the one true God, serving the God of Israel with one Torah for everyone, without trying to steal the rights of each other. We all have a place. We're all special, but we also are all not special, because if we're not as one, there's nothing. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this. A little preachy, I will admit. A little preachy at the end there. Maybe even the beginning as well. But there's a point to be driven here, because the division is so painful. The division is so terrible. Seeing everyone arguing all the time, left, right, and center, it breaks my heart to see this all the time. This is why I always say, if you disagree with me, it's perfectly fine. I'm not going to be offended as long as you do it in a manner that we can learn from one another. We try. And you have to remember also, sometimes we write to one another, it's not always clear what the person's mood is. Unless the person uses language there, it's very clear what they intend. But most of the time, I think most of us at the end of the day do want to have us back with God in God's temple, back on earth, that we can serve him in the true way that he designed in the Torah. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, share with your friends, comment. It's all good. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to be offended if you disagree with me. If you agree with me, awesome. We found something to work together with. But in any case, share with your friends, share with your family. Don't forget to go to HebrewInIsrael.net. That's the website if you're listening on iTunes or YouTube. I have other things there as well. There's lots of material there. Hebrew in Israel is about a lot of different things. Though on a regular basis I teach Hebrew and Tanakh, but Hebrew in Israel I do with a lot of different subjects. And again, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for joining me. Kol Tuv.